Hello, good afternoon.
Hey, how's it going, Nico? How are you doing? Hey, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Great, thanks for joining us and for this session on KubeCon and Cilium Sessions. Looking forward to it. Should be a good one. Right. So KubeCon concluded last Friday, and we thought we would help the community, and watch all the KubeCon sessions on and essentially give you a little summary of what we've seen, what we heard.
Maybe a longer summary on some.
Yeah.
It's hard to condense them to a sentence, Yeah.
And I mean, I have sped watch about 12 sessions in double speed. And there are some really excellent stuff out there. But what we should perhaps do is, I think it's your first time on eCHO, so maybe you should start by introducing yourself first.
Yeah, perfect. Oh, I was nervous there was going to be like some echo tradition that I was going to have to list 3 things or something. Hey everyone, I'm Jeremy. So I'm a senior TME here at Isovalent, and my focus area is security. So my background is in security engineering. I used to do implementations, run vulnerability scans, do patching cycles on late nights, on weekends at terribly odd hours. But now I get to work with wonderful folks here at Isovalent, and especially close with Nico here, and excited to talk through some of the exciting sessions from KubeCon, and specifically the ones around the security side were really interesting to me. I think really fun stuff, really, really interesting this year. And I love that they include the slides. Like I'm already kind of like picking apart little pieces of these slides to gather for later, or just getting these ideas going. Really exciting.
Excellent. Yeah. So the way we split things between us, and you will see what I'm doing, but what we've been doing is, so you've been watching more of the Tetragon and security sessions, and I've been watching more of the Hubble one. Now, I thought just to randomize the order, I would print a list of sessions, and then I would do some kind of, like a draw, and I'm just cutting them out now. So I'm doing this live. And I've just gone back to paper because why not? So I think we've got about 15 or 16 sessions. There was the Cilium and eBPF day, which was on Tuesday.
Yep.
I think. And then there were a number of sessions throughout the week. I think in total,
we didn't even touch rejects. There's the whole rejects.
Yes.
And the weekend before. That can be its own, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I get the impression that rejects has more and more like technical sessions, and KubeCon tends to be perhaps just a bit less. Although some of the sessions, like the one that we're going to cover shortly, were really, really quite deep. So, could we get? I'm going to start shuffling in a moment. If you're watching live, let us know. Let's see who's here. I've got Joseph who's here.
Hey Joseph, how's it going?
Got Tony.
Hey Tony. Where are you guys watching from?
I guess I know where these guys are watching from, but I will let them comment. So whoever are watching, let us know where you're watching it from. Jeremy, you are based in Switzerland, but you are not Swiss.
No, maybe my accent gives it away, but I'm based in Zurich, but I'm not from Zurich. I'm from the US.
And you're heading back to the US for Thanksgiving, I believe.
Yeah, next week is Turkey Day, Thanksgiving.
Turkey Day, awesome.
Going back, see the folks, see some friends, and should be nice. So today, yesterday was the first day of snowfall here in Zurich. So I would point you guys out the window, but yeah, it's just all snow everywhere on the trees. It's beautiful.
Awesome. Right. So what I'm going to start is with my Isovalent back. And I'm just going to put all the sessions in there with shuffle. And we are going to start with Cilium connecting, it's the first session, Cilium connecting, observing, and securing Kubernetes and beyond with eBPF. So that's going to be me.
Nice.
And that was one of the session. I'm going to go and share screen. That was one of the session of the CNCF day, which was this. Oh no, it wasn't actually. So
yeah, and because we're covering Cilium Day, I grabbed from the office. I got my Cilium mug in honor.
Excellent. Right, so let me present as well. Share screen, and we're going to share that window. Here we go. Right, hopefully you can see all this.
Yeah, it looks good to me. Yeah.
So that was one of the first sessions that was like some kind of project. It's a project update. It's customer kind of user case studies, and also a reintroduction to Tetragon and an update on Tetragon by Anna. This one are always worth attending. So I took a few notes, which I'm going to share with you. But so we start with Bill doing a reintroduction of the Cilium project, the main use cases, and talking about some of the momentum behind Cilium, so 20,000 stars. And what Bill was trying to reemphasize was it was more than just, it's not like the stars are a bit of a vanity thing. Oh, look, we get stars, but like stars without the community participating is, it's kind of worthless to some extent. So what Bill was really like emphasized about was the growth in the contributors, in the companies involved. It's lots of different companies, and outside of Isovalent, Google, Datadog, lots of different individuals and companies contributed to Cilium, and velocity in terms of the project, and the number of commits, pull requests and everything is phenomenal to see. So that's not slowed down at all. And same for the number of case studies and the number of public users, which you can find on Cilia.io. The adoption has been phenomenal and remains really high. And there have been a couple of things that were also announced at KubeCon. One was this, which we were very proud of, which was a case study which was really end-user based on the tools that Kubernetes, that CNCF users recommend for multi-cluster management, right? So that's a super common problem, right? Once you build a couple of clusters, and how do you connect them together? How do you configure and secure, etc.? So the one that came out on top was Cilium as part of the survey was recommended as the one to adopt. You get hold, assess, trial, adopt, and Argo, CD, and Cilium came out as the main projects. So Argo for deployment workflow, and Cilium for and it would be cluster mesh, Cilium cluster mesh to connect all the clusters, and I'll give a shout out to Joseph, who's here as well. He recently published a video where he connected 512 cluster, I think, together using Cilium cluster mesh through automation. So that's pretty amazing, phenomenal, and I know that Joseph's done some demos and videos. So that's how many clusters you can put together through using Cilium. So again, that was a nice little update by Bill. The other thing that I like was a couple of case studies. So there was one from Ahmed at the New York Times. So that's not the first video that Ahmed has done for Cilium. He's done a couple of other presentations. But they're talking about how they use Cilium at the New York Times. New York Times is more than than the news. It's also Wordle. The Athletic was acquired, so for your sports news. So and the way they operate is they've got all the multi-account architecture with lots of different teams and lots of different clusters. And they use a number of different tools like Carpenter, Istio, OPA to to manage their cluster and to provide like network isolations using network policies. Just look at the some of the sites. Again, this is a short version what we're showing you, but what some of the case studies I've shown in Cilium eBPF and in some of the sessions throughout the week was the scale at which some of these users are deploying Cilium is phenomenal. And one of the use cases that is huge for any users on EKS is around IP address exhaustion. That's just one of the use cases that we see a lot when people are using Cilium in the cloud, is to overcome issues with a number of IP addresses that are assigned to pods. And in using Cilium, you can use something called ENI mode that enables you to assign more IP addresses to your pods. And that's a use case which is popular. So that was the New York Times. We also had Ascend, Joe from Ascend. Joe Stevens also did a case study around Cilium, maybe last year. And Ascend.io, our data pipeline automation company. And their use case is interesting. Again, it's kind of a multi-cloud. They're using EKS, GKE, AKS. And one of the things that they like about it is how Cilium gives them that kind of consistent networking layer. And I like that quote. This is like Hubble is the best network policy debugger around, and there were a number of sessions around Hubble throughout the week. So that's again a part of the appeal for Joe. And he also mentioned about IP saturation, right? Overcoming issues that you may have with assigning IP addresses to your pods, and that's kind of part of the value of Cilium. He also mentioned a couple of performance-related use cases, Netkit, Big TCP, and I wrote a couple of deep dive blog posts about both of these topics. So I was, this is something close to that I'm excited about is being able to boost performance with Cilium around Kubernetes networking. So this was a great session, and I concluded the session with an update on Tetragon. And Jeremy is your baby, but for me it was like so she did a little recap. She talked about like the policy library, and it looks like this policy library, which Tetragon monitors and secures, applications.
The policy library is great. I think you can even pull up like the tetragon.io website if you want, and there's a great kind of growing repository of ready to apply policies. You just can put like the target namespace or target workload. And it's growing. I mean, we're seeing a lot more interest. Yeah, documentation, and then on the left, policy library.
Nice.
And observability policies. I think, the idea is eventually you have some enforcement policies built out as well, but you can already see, that's probably a little more than a dozen or so policies. And, one of the most common ones maybe is that those around system calls up top where you see like the set user ID system call or something like that. I feel that's a common theme we saw comparisons and the talks that we'll talk about later on this call around seccomp, which obviously focuses on system calls. So, yeah.
Cool. So yeah, that was, and I mentioned how kind of committee maintained again. It's a number of people involved in creating policies. It's ever growing. There was a new feature which I wasn't necessarily familiar with around when a Tetragon agent was restarted. There used to be a thing where eBPF programs would be deleted, and so there was a period where programs where Tetragon's policies were not enforced, if I understood correctly. And what they've added with this robust enforcement is that it's kind of persistent, and the programs remain loaded even during a restart.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so before the default was anytime the agent was coming down, or let's imagine you're upgrading your agent, the Tetragon sensor would unload all of the policies. And right. Now you can have, it's a pretty simple, just like a true flag onto this argument. And you can make your policies, you don't have to have them all. You can have certain subset of policies be persistent. So when you bring the agent down, these policies don't get unloaded. And that's actually recent from 1.14.
Cool. Yeah. And yeah, just a final thing, like the adoption of Tetragon, again, it's just super encouraging to see a number of contributors and commits and stars. Just steady, and there were, I think, probably there's never been as many Tetragon sessions at this KubeCon as there was last week. So great momentum around it.
Yeah.
So next.
Anticipation. Ooh.
Yeah, it has to be a Tetragon, so I get to get myself some water.
Yeah.
Right, that's going to be the next Cilium one. I'm cheating. Okay. Here we go. This is a good one. This one is the panel exploring eBPF use cases in cloud native security.
Perfect.
So I will stop sharing my screen for a sec. So, and I will let you cover this one.
Well, I'll share my screen. So for this one, there's no slides. It's obviously a panel, but I'll just have something on the screen so you can also kind of follow along and get a little bit of context. So this was a really well done panel. I think at the end of eBPF and Cilium Day, we had Whitney Lee kind of hosting this. We had Ashrat Nir from Armo. We had Anna from Isovalent, Maya from Microsoft, and Courtney from CubeShop. And they basically spent about 30, 40 minutes or so going over what is eBPF and what are kind of the key use cases that they themselves are building on. And each of them has a really interesting project that they're working on. In fact, let me see if I can pull up this really interesting Inspector Gadget project that I believe Maya was talking about, or maybe it was Courtney. So had you heard of Inspector Gadget before, Nico? Or
I had heard of, but I've never used it, and I didn't realize it was. I guess I don't know if it's Microsoft led or but yeah, I heard of it, but never played with it.
Yeah. So I hadn't heard of it either, but it was brought up in the context of the idea of with great power comes great responsibility, and how do we kind of trust our eBPF programs, and how do we know that these policies are safe and verified? And obviously a lot of the discussion was around the eBPF verifier and kind of watching who's loading these programs. But another thing that was brought up was, sometimes it's pretty difficult to write a good policy. So you might not actually write your own policies. You might be sourcing them from somewhere else. And I think what Inspector Gadget does is kind of offer this toolkit or kind of base area to have eBPF programs that you can deploy from. Of course, if anyone watching this is involved in Inspector Gadget, please drop a hello and correct me along the way if I'm not doing it a good service. But it sounded really interesting, so I've been kind of diving into this this morning, and I've got it bookmarked for next week as well. But this was just one of the many things. I think having a panel is interesting. You get to hear a lot of different voices. you get to hear a lot of like what is interesting to this set of users. So kind of shifting back to the panel itself, the first thing they talked about was, eBPF for the different use cases, starting with networking. And one of the key ones we saw was filtering and managing network traffic. And I believe Maya was talking about kind of a good first project for some people might be trying to build a firewall with eBPF. Just use XDP, hook into these packets, and really try and build out a very simple firewall, maybe even filtering on IP addresses, which, with more advanced use cases, we know we want to move beyond IP addresses. But I thought it was just a really good introduction as well to, talking about how eBPF is event-driven. You have these network hooks, and you can build out these programs that trigger as the network events come in to build out a firewall use case. I thought that was a strong first one.
Yeah.
The discussion kind of then led into more of the runtime components, and that's where Anna from Isovalent got to talk a bit more about Tetragon, which is always exciting. So I think there's a few areas we'll talk about Tetragon, but the main thing she was emphasizing was this kind of two key use cases. At the runtime level, we care about observability, and then we also care about enforcement. And both are great use cases for Tetragon. And I think the enforcement one kept getting brought up a little bit later, and the observability piece kind of tied into this idea of overhead and like how much resource utilization was going on. So there's just a really strong discussion. Let me fast forward so you're not just looking at this, but you can kind of see what the panel setup looked like.
It's nice to also have a very diverse panel for a change, but that's a success to celebrate.
It was amazing. Yeah, I really encourage everyone to watch this. I thought it was a great introduction to eBPF, and then also sharing some really technical bits around, like I said, I'd never heard of the Inspector Gadget project before. And now I have something really interesting to follow along with and maybe get involved with or something down the line. But it was fantastic to hear the different voices. There was a lot of talk too around when Anna brought up the observability piece of Tetragon and eBPF. The idea of, okay, well, what kind of events do we want to hook into? And, we don't want to overload our system, and we want to be smart about how much overhead we're creating and how we capture the right data. So some really fun discussion around that as well.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So we are down to the next one, which I picked before, which is going to be from Samsung Ads. This is live migrating production cluster from Calico to Cilium. And I found it super interesting for a few different reasons. And one way, I've been to, I think, maybe 4 KubeCons since I've been at Isovalent. And the number of times we get people that are coming into the booth and be like, oh, how do I migrate, right, from Calico to Cilium? Right? And how to do it in a way which is reasonably seamless. And these two gentlemen were talking about this. And they evaluated a number of different methods, right? Because there are lots of different ways you can do migration. But what you want is something that is reliable, something you can roll back, right? Something goes wrong, and you want to be able to do it in a gradual manner with as little impact to your live services. And in the end, they tried a few different things, and in the end, and I was very happy that they selected a method which is called the per node configuration migration, and it's something which is in the docs, but I also documented in a tutorial which I published last year, and essentially enables you to kind of roll out new nodes and to have almost as kind of half dual like networking plane, and you install Cilium, as I say here, as a second overlay, but it's not managing any workloads. And then you start draining some nodes that are running the old CNI, and in that case, it was Calico. and then they will go and be managed on the nodes that are running Cilium, and you keep going until you've done the whole migration. And eventually, they migrated over 20 clusters, and some of them with hundreds of nodes. So that's pretty big scale as well. It's not just like I do here or like we do in our labs. We have a couple of labs that show this. We have one around migrating from Planet and one for migrating from Calico to Cilium. But you just have like a 3 or 4 node cluster running Kine. Here, what their testimony shows is that you can do it. You can do it with large scale cluster with hundreds and hundreds of nodes, and the result was no service interruption, which I thought was pretty amazing, right? So
that's awesome.
So that's brilliant. So again, that's a great one to watch if you're interested in migrating to Cilium and minimizing any kind of interruption or impact to your business applications. So check them out. Now, so are we on next?
Got to be a tetragon.
It's going to be a tetragon. All right. I've got eBPF for creating least privilege policies.
Perfect. Yeah, so this one, really fantastic talk. Let me share my screen because sadly the slides aren't up yet. But let me. This was a really strong talk from 2 isovalent colleagues of ours, Natalia and John. And what they did is it was in 2 stages. The first was, how do you approach kind of strategically why you need a least privilege policy in a cloud native environment? And then the second part was really, how do we actually go about building out a least privilege policy with eBPF? And I think the first part is pretty convincing. Let me just share a couple moments of this, just looking at the CNCF landscape. If I zoom in, does that zoom in for you as well?
I mean, it's a CNCF landscape is going to be, it's like zooming into the map of the world, right?
We're not going to pick out any words on this screen, but I just wanted to show it's incredible how big it is and diverse. And I think there's really no standard deployment for how you deploy your cloud native workloads right now. There's not kind of a one size fits all. People are kind of having a little different bits and pieces of projects from all over. And with that comes this idea of it's pretty hard in Kubernetes to know what this baseline least privilege should be for these different projects. Especially as you're scaling up, there's kind of this challenge of scale of, you have lots of different data, you have lots of different kind of natural paths that your data might flow through. How do you actually know and baseline what is good and what is bad? So as we kind of continue out, this is Natalia explaining why it's difficult to get a baseline of your Kubernetes workload for a least privilege policy. What are some of the different things that we might be interested in as we're thinking about least privilege policies? Restricting access to only specific binaries or specific user sets, or maybe you have a subset of target workloads that you're looking to protect, but it sits on a node with another workload that you actually want to allow access for certain binaries or certain files to. So being able to be flexible in your environments as well is really important. Then kind of as we scale up our workloads, the challenge scales as well. When you have restrictions, as you scale, those restrictions might get in the way of daily behaviors that are expected or daily behaviors that you want your workloads to perform with. So with that, we kind of have this consensus, I would say, of it's a little difficult to actually frame and get this baseline of a least privilege policy. From there, we kind of move into what John and Natalia talk about with why eBPF is so good for this, and how you can use Tetragon, which is a generic eBPF toolkit in a way for security use cases, to first off get just a really strong baseline of a workload. So imagine you write a policy that, and he talks through the architecture of Tetragon, which I think quite a few different talks do, so I won't harp on that for too long. But the first thing you can do is, imagine, I think they set up a demo environment where they first used eBPF to just get an understanding of what are all of the events flying around in the system. What does it take for my environment to get started up? What are like the syscalls? What are the different process events that are required to actually start up in this system? And what's it need to actually operate at full scale? And then from there, you can use that as the baseline to then build out specific policies that allow those and disallow everything outside of it. And this same demo we'll see as well when we talk about SefComp, but it's this idea of using eBPF to capture a strong baseline and then use those same eBPF events to build out policies to protect against deviations from that baseline. So I thought it was really strong. There's a lot of interesting corollaries to this that I think get touched on. Like one was somewhere in here. Yeah, this was a fun one, was the idea being that, a lot of CVEs are working outside of the natural path of how your workload might operate. So by restricting things to only what should happen, a natural improvement might be you're kind of reducing your risk surface from unknown CVEs. So it's just like this natural effect of, by hardening your surface, you're naturally mitigating some of the CVE risk without even directly approaching it, which is a great advantage of a least privilege policy. So
and it's sorry to interrupt. It's just, it feels like it's very like zero trust, the same approach we use in and often from my perspective, I've done like microsegmentation and zero trust, like building network policies. This is more about, like more as a runtime and processes and like actual roles and privileges. I come from like the networking space, but it's the same, right? You establish your baseline. You start with, okay, well, who needs what? Well, what do you need to do? And then you create that baseline, you create your policies, you verify your policies, you implement your policies, and you verify that it's effective. So that model is just seeing that model apply through Tetragon is really cool.
And it's iterative. I think that's one of the things too, is it's not you make a policy on day one and it's the same policy that's going to exist in 100 days or 300 days. The idea behind eBPF and Tetragon 2 is that it's very dynamic, and on the fly you can change these policies. You can modify and update. We talked about the persistent enforcement feature as well, and there's just advantages too, where when you're filtering in the kernel, you're not kind of moving a bunch of stuff into user space and then deciding, hey, is this interesting to me? You're not kind of wasting a lot of that overhead of waking up user space a lot. So
so that's, I'm going to just move on to the next one. We just it feels like a good segue into if we can, that session.
Yeah, but if there's a way, is there a way to drop the link from these to people watching, or
in the comments? Yeah,
is that possible?
On the right hand side, you should have a comments. Yeah,
I might link to some of these. In fact, actually, first I'll link Dean from our team, and I think Nico, you helped as well, wrote a wonderful blog post kind of summarizing some of the talks from KubeCon. So I'll put that in the chat right now. This also gives you kind of a written version of a lot of the interesting summaries from KubeCon.
Because you were talking about like building the kind of the process of building that least privilege. I thought I would just segue into eBay and how they talked at the Cilium eBPF day and how they are building least privilege, but again, more from like a network perspective, right? So how are they enforcing network segmentation? And I will just find the slides. I will find it. Here we go. I think that's this one here. And this is their, oops. Can you see my screen still?
Yeah, it looks great.
Yeah.
We're on service dependencies.
Yeah, and again, you were showing how we have this this method of creating these privileged policies, and here this is their method of creating segmentation policies. And I've been doing microsegmentation since 2016 when I was at VMware working on NSX, and with the same principles apply to Kubernetes, right? So especially we start with a brownfield environment where you get a cluster, you get applications running, and you want to start creating network policies to only allow the flows that are necessary, right? So first you discover what's going on, how every microservice talks to each other, right? And eBay, they've got more than 5,000 microservices. They've got hundreds of clusters. They've got, every cluster has hundreds, if not thousands of nodes. And there are some clusters have more than 100,000 pods. So, it's massive. So the first thing they have to go and do is discover the service dependencies. From that, they have to go and create network policies to limit that traffic, right? That they observed. Then they do some kind of manual approval or semi manual. Then they enforce the policies, and just like you said before, how it's like an iterative process, and then monitors the violations of the policies and kind of do this perpetually. So that's an interesting use case as well from eBay. It's how do we do microsegmentation at scale when you've got a huge brownfield environment, right? Where do you start? And I just like how they explain. I provide these kind of easy 4 steps to follow to get to a zero trust environment. Cool. All right. So I'm going to do another wheel. I think we had a more Cilium as this one. I'm going to cover next, which is seeing double, which is one from double. Yeah. Right. So this is something else I enjoy. And that was from Luis, who works at iSurveillance as a software engineer, and he talked about multicast. And this multicast was my first ever project in networking. That was like in 20 years ago. And I used to work in a university. I was doing an internship in university where we were using multicast to distribute software across workstations, and multicast is really hard. It's very complicated, and when you combine it to multicast with eBPF in Kubernetes, it's
challenge. Yeah,
it's a challenge.
Stack complexity. I don't think anything from that stack is taking away complexity.
But and Luis kind of he started his presentation by saying this is going to be a nerdy session. We're going to go deep, and he goes really deep into eBPF, eBPF data path, and explain, looking into the eBPF, really explaining how traffic is distributed, why we might use multicast, and multicast is a way to efficiently distribute the traffic across the network. Unicast is one-to-one, broadcast is one to everyone, and multicast is one to several, one to whoever is interested in that traffic. So he reintroduced multicast for 15-20 minutes, and then he talks more about how it was implemented in Cilium, which I think is really interesting. It's also extremely advanced, but it talks about how it's built within within Cilium, and again how we're using eBPF to store information about who's sending and who's receiving the traffic. So this is maybe not for everyone, because it's like super complex, but it's good to have like a session that are just a bit more like advanced level compared to some others. So yeah, this one I enjoyed. I enjoy speed watching. Just looking at the time, we are doing quite well. The next one is don't get blown up, avoiding configuration gotchas for Tetragon newbies. That's one for you.
Let me see. Oh, is this the this was a really good one. Yeah, this was the lightning talk, right? Let me pull up the session. So Pratik from Reddit did a fantastic lightning talk. Let me share my screen. During eBPF and Cilium Day. And yeah, I think, talking through it, it sounds like they were previously using OS Query, had some bottlenecks, and so they started looking into eBPF and Tetragon. Are you seeing my screen now? Or?
Yes, sorry.
Perfect.
Here we go.
Amazing. Yeah, so Pratik Loshia, who's actually, I think he's been involved in quite a few of like the CNCF SecurityCon events, pretty involved in like the tag security group as well. So yeah, like I mentioned, they'd been using OS Query and they were looking for something with a little bit easier overhead, maybe a little more context as well. And so he described his kind of first experiences with Tetragon and kind of a guiding light for, hey, don't do these 5 things. And I'll just walk you through them really quick. So the first one is network security, which we'll talk about. Let me see if that's the next slide. Number 1, the first one's, don't log everything. And I thought this was a funny reference to logging everything everywhere all at once is kind of the play on words here. But yeah, his main thing was just don't log everything. It's really hard to go through the haystack in user space and decide what's important after the fact. eBPF and Tetragon offer really good filtering within the kernel. And so, take advantage of that and, have a policy that's slimmer to start with and then expand the scope of it. The second one, network monitoring is hard. There's a lot of noise. It's really hard to make sense of the noise. And it's not that Tetragon is or eBPF isn't suited for network events. It's just that if you're a newbie to Tetragon or a newbie to eBPF, this might be one of the areas where you don't focus on to start with. It's one of the, kind of second or third policy stages that you might want to get to, but start with like process, exit, and enter events. Start with some syscalls, and then work your way up to network events. And I think, Nico, you and I have talked about one of the more interesting pieces of Tetragon in general is, using network events and tying that to the underlying binary. So it's one of the really interesting use cases of Tetragon is network monitoring. But for someone new to the space, I think I agree that, get your feet wet, get comfortable with some of the simpler policies, and then you can build up with network monitoring. He moves into, avoid process events in prod. Anyone who's used Tetragon, one of the first things you do when you open it up is you just see process, exit, and open events just like flying around. And there's tons of these coming in. And if you're in a prod environment and you turn on the fire hose, you might see a ton of these process events moving around. So the first thing you might want to do if you're trying this out and moving it up from some UAT environment is maybe, keep the lid on the process events to start and have a more singular policy. And I think that's a common theme we're seeing in his rules. The fourth thing was using metrics. So there's a lot of really interesting use cases that metrics offer. Some of it is around just the health of your Tetragon agent, like being able to understand, is this policy taking up too much memory space? Is it using too much of my resource bandwidth? Is it causing any bandwidth issues? But also Tetragon's really good at capturing metrics around the health of your environment, such as what's the throughput of my network events? kind of an ironic, don't focus too much on network events early on, but use metrics here. But the main thing is
be smarter about it, right? Just don't export everything, but maybe use threshold, maybe just to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I think the right metrics tell you a story of how your environment is doing and give you the ability to then dig in deeper. It gives you that high level view of this is the health of these workloads. And then from there, you can pinpoint exactly with eBPF, the exact binary that's maybe causing the second look or the hiccup that's interesting to you. Also, the right metrics early on let you build that baseline to then see what's this anomaly, what's deviating from that baseline, which we've talked about a couple of times. And then finally, this is a pretty fun one. So those of you who don't use Tetragon yet, because everyone is almost a Tetragon adopter, right? There's two ways to export your events. You can use like the JSON event, which is very classic output, or you can use this gRPC endpoint. And Pratik mentioned that he really enjoyed using the gRPC endpoint. A bit of a pull model versus a push, but eBPF is really efficient. And sometimes that longer form JSON event can be a little heavier. So I thought this was a really great kind of quick hit introduction to his experiences with Tetragon and with eBPF in general. And yeah, I would recommend.
Awesome. I wasn't really, that's a great idea on the gRPC versus JSON. Yeah, JSON can be, very verbose, which is also part of the beauty of Tetragon, right?
Yeah.
But if you're only after like a specific item from the event, and why not?
Yeah.
Cool. I also just wanted to give a quick shout out. Marianne was I just love the interaction between our guests, and he mentioned to Tony that his adaptation of Kubernetes with FreeBSD was very cool, and he was thinking of adopting Cilium into BSD. So again, I like when our guests chat with each other while watching. So appreciate having some of our experts joining the conversations. Well, this is the next one, which is one of my favorite projects in the whole Kubernetes space, is going to be Gateway API. What's new? What's next? Which is, I'm guessing is partially Cilium, but we had a couple of our ISO colleagues in there, so we just wanted to get them a shout out. So I'm going to get slides up. So Gateway API, successor to the Ingress API, and how we bring load balance route traffic into a cluster. I've wrote a Gateway API tutorial on isovalent.com a couple of years ago. It's one of my favorite features. We got a couple of labs that are super popular, and it's ever evolving as a project. And we've got two folks from Isovalent, Nick, who's one of the leaders of the project, and Christine is now really heavily involved as well. And they covered a couple of different things. What I was going to emphasize particularly is now that the Gateway API is kind of becoming a very well-adopted project, was it just trying to formalize more the release process, which is going to be more like regular with scoping, iterating on new features and APIs and doing some like release candidates. So release 1.2 came out a few weeks ago, and I think 1.3 is the next one. And some of the new features are the infrastructure label. I know it's something that many people have been asking for. That's now stable, essentially. And that's the way to propagate metadata from your gateway from your services onto like other objects that are related. which is super useful when you're using Gateway API in cloud providers. And then they keep adding features to Gateway API, like timeouts and durations, retries, and this one here. This is they're currently in the scoping phase for the next release. Things like the authorization, which is auth and OZ, which is something that they started to be working on. Gateway API to especially from like north-south, where you want to be able to do things like JSON Web Token, like web authorization, authentication. That's kind of one of the things that are missing before people can move from Ingress to Gateway API. And obviously that's something that they started to work on. And what they're also working on things is like Ingress to Gateway, which is a way to migrate to translate the configuration from Ingress into Gateway API. So that's on one of the sessions. We're doing quite well so far.
Yeah, we're doing great.
I'm almost at the end of my bag.
Well, I'm looking at the clock. I'm like, I've got a couple I really want to talk about and highlight. But
right, so we'll do right. This is what agent to trust with your Kubernetes: Falco, Tetragon, or KubeArmor.
That's perfect. That's one of them. I was going to say we should 100% recommend people to watch. I feel like I'm pretty in tune to the security space, especially from a cloud native perspective. And even I struggle with how do I differentiate between these different cloud native security tools? Tetragon, Falco, Tracy, KubeArmor. I'm sharing my screen now.
Here we go. Sorry.
Perfect. And, I think there's a lot of familiarity between these different projects, but it's hard to parse out, okay, well, what's the best use case for this one? I think Kyle Quest did a talk at KubeCon EU last year, or maybe in the spring or something, that helped a little bit with framing, I think, Tetragon and Falco and maybe Tracy as well. I forget exactly, or maybe it was KubeArmor. But I thought that was really great. I think this one is fantastic as well. So what we saw here is Henrik Rexed from Dynatrace kind of going through a bit of the paces around what he called the Cube Olympics, which is kind of fun. Like I said, I think in a 30-minute session, he does a really great job of highlighting what are some of the performance kind of benchmarks that he cares about. What is the observability baseline for each of these projects? What are the different components that are like the dependencies required to run these 4 different projects? And then how do you actually build and apply a policy with all of them? And all of that kind of comes together to, how he ranks them into, what is a good agent, the conditions for a good agent for your environment, that kind of discussion. So I'm going to go over it for the next couple of minutes, but I really do encourage a lot of you to watch this call, watch the session. It's kind of funny. I think the name of his talk was talking about Falco, Tetragon, and KubeArmor. And then I think he mentioned like a week before or something, he said, well, why not throw in Tracy? We're all thinking about it. And it's fun to get another competitor in the field from his quote unquote athletes. So one of the first things that he'll do is he'll kind of compare each solution for experience, the different components, the observability level that you get from each, and then the benchmarking results as well. And just to kind of quickly summarize it, essentially what we're going to be looking at is there's a lot of similarities between them all. I think we know that Falco has a pretty advanced, this is, I think, the Falco deployment components required, but it has a pretty advanced rule set out of the box that you can use for, threat rules, capturing things, looking at different events. But it also requires, I think, like the Falco server, or I forgot the exact naming convention they use. Let me see if they have like they pipe out events through their Falco server. Tetragon, pretty similar. You can use eBPF similar to Tracy to capture really low-level events. They all have like a hint of eBPF to varying degrees. I think it's agreed that Tetragon and Tracy use eBPF kind of the most, and I think Tetragon, what he talks about in this session is that Tetragon kind of takes advantage of it in the most advanced ways. But let's see, I want to make sure I'm also being able to share some of the interesting summaries. So from his stages of observability, this is kind of the 5 categories that he looked about. First, like what can I capture? What is some of the interesting context and events? Is it getting me the right metadata to the level that I need for a Kubernetes environment? Am I able to filter in the kernel? Am I able to filter events easily? One interesting thing to note from Falco was each event has a different structure. So it's a little difficult once you get an event out to have this uniform set of evaluating events. Whereas, Tetragon, KubeArmor, and Tracy all have a more uniform set of how events come out and format back to you. Default policies as well. We talked about, I think in an earlier session, the growing library of Tetragon default policies, but that's actually the only one that was really missing here for the Tetragon category. We already talked about Falco really having that default rule set. Tracy also has a good amount of default rules as well. One thing that was interesting that I learned, so I haven't played around with KubeArmor too much myself, but there's no X here for default policies, but he did say that there's a pretty extensive library that KubeArmor has as well. So I need to check that out. That'll be pretty interesting to see. He said it was a little bit of a struggle to find the right policy for his use cases, but that there was actually a pretty strong list of policies out of the box. Ability to react. I think this is the enforcement bubble that we'll talk about. So the ability within the kernel to say, let's kill this process, let's block this process, override it. Tetragon obviously has a really strong enforcement story around it, being able to sit in the kernel and either override the value or send a sig kill to stop the process from executing. Along the way, I see we're kind of nearing time, so I'll just kind of skip even further. He then does some benchmarking as well, where he talks about, I care about the memory overhead, I care about the latency impact from these different tools. And there was a really fun quote that I think I'll share. Let's see. When he talks about loading up each project onto his demo environment. So this is his, this is his constant load with no policies. This is the quote. On the CPU side, Tetragon is consuming almost nothing, which is just a really strong indication that compared to Falco, KubeArmor, and Tracy has quite a bit going on here. It really felt like Tetragon was invisible to his workload, which is just a really strong indicator of when you go all in on eBPF, you get the benefits that people tout around that low overhead, around that memory usage as well. And then just to kind of end it, like I said, I really encourage you to watch the whole thing because it's not easy to simplify it into one slide and just say, hey, Tetragon's the best for all use cases. I don't think that's his main takeaway at all, but it was really nice to see Tetragon get some plaudits for the paces that he was going through and the use cases that he was interested in. But I learned a ton about Falco, about Tracy as well, and KubeArmor along the way. So highly encourage you to check this out if you're interested in all the projects.
Yeah, no, that's a great session. This obviously we're biased.
yeah, it's hard not to bleed the bias in there, but I mean the last slide had Tetragon up top, so I couldn't. Is it unfair? Is it unfounded? Maybe.
No. Well, that's why we have to let people kind of watch and make their own
absolutely
conclusions out of it. But
cool. Little interesting bits around each project, kind of how they operate or how you can build a policy and how you can wrangle these events from each agent and then pull it back out into user space. I thought it was great.
Cool. I'm going to have to go shortly. I just feel like I need to give a shout out to a couple of sessions. The last sessions we'll cover today. So I'll get childcare because the snow has been falling for the past 24 hours. So the school is closed, and I've got kids running around in the background.
Sounds fun though.
The only things I wanted to highlight was a couple of sessions that were done by Ryan. That was during Cilium and eBPF Day, which was around accelerating IPsec performance using Cilium. Right. That's and he explained pretty well how, by default, the CPU, an IPsec flow is tied to a CPU essentially. So that's kind of the bottleneck when you encrypt traffic with IPsec. But you can use an option where we essentially add some data to the header, which makes the flow for an IPsec traffic to go across multiple different CPUs. So suddenly you're able to load balance traffic using of IPsec, so you're able to massively scale. And he's actually been working on a pull request, which I think hopefully will be merged within the Cilium for Cilium 117. And he saw like some of the performance results were phenomenal. So highly recommend this one. And there was another one which was done by Anton and Daniel, who both work on the iSurveillance, which was on WireGuard, improving WireGuard encryption. So it was very kind of a similar talk, but it was looking at the other way we encrypt traffic within Cilium is using WireGuard. And again, it's looking at how can we reduce the cost that comes with encrypting data in transit. Really technical session, but again, that just shows some of the areas that we are exploring to improve performance. Some of them will require the kernel to be updated. Some of them will require changes to be ported into Cilium. But I think that's, what I saw in from the watching all this session at KubeCon is there's a lot of emphasis around like performance and scale. This is like, moving into like SIM is like massively adopted with lots and lots of features, but now how do we make sure that enabling a feature at scale or multiple features and enabling encryption does not impact some of the other stuff we're trying to do. So yeah, a huge amount of excellent sessions. I think there were like something like 25 sessions throughout the week.
Yeah, a lot.
And yeah, we've been spending the past couple of days like speed watching them. And there are a couple we won't have the time to cover today. Datadog, some really cool like cluster mesh across at mega scale from the Cilium and eBPF Day. Some Cilium at the edge. Sorry,
there was a couple kind of tutorial-based stuff that's like walkthrough that I thought was really interesting too, where take like the Kubernetes kind of security guide and then actually implement it using Cilium and Tetragon. That was like a pretty interesting workshop one.
There was also a Kubernetes networking in 30 minutes by James Strong and somebody else, I think from Broadcom. Which I did a session with Dan Finneran at KubeCon Paris, which was kind of an intro to Cilium and Kubernetes networking, and my perspective, the way I deliver it through the networking side, but they focused more on the Linux networking and namespaces and virtual Ethernet, which I thought was excellent, was a great demo. So you and I, Jeremy, we should try to turn this discussion into a blog post, right? To help.
We should.
Yeah, we've been watching all these sessions, so we should make it kind of summarize everything we've noticed from KubeCon. Wow, we I think should better leave it. We've been going for a good hour, and I've got kids.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us for the last hour. If you were at KubeCon, hopefully, we helped you kind of catch up on some sessions that were overlapping or something like that. Or if there was another session that you loved, definitely reach out and we should highlight it in the blog post. Don't want to miss anything.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks everyone for watching, and we hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you in the next one.
Enjoy. Thanks, y'all.
All right. Cheers.